Joseph Simpson swooped down on the range country, built himself a little shack in the bottom of the arroyo where bubbled a spring, and then started in the cattle business. He had one poor, flea-bitten Galloway and one bronco. The bronco was a pinto, watch-eyed and sprung-kneed, and all down his right side were the brands of his previous owners, with their counterbrands reaching from ears to the fly disturber, and all of his left side were numerous mathematical calculations, with an occasional sign of the zodiac burned in a way of variety. The Galloway cow looked so lonesome, and the pony was so dejected that Joseph Simpson did the best he could the next spring, rustled around before the regular roundup started, and then rested was a numerous progeny for the friendless cow and the dejected pinto. Joseph Simpson's success only served to whet his ambition, and so he went on increasing his cow and horse herds. But strange as it may appear, as the blank page of Joseph Simpson's increase books were rapidly filling, his neighbors noted correspondingly falling off in the census of their respective herds. The following winter, the Galloway got nipped in a blizzard, and the pinto also sank to rest under the weight of his years. The next spring, Joseph Simpson formed a cattle trust. The capital stock comprised the now numerous relics of the late Galloway and pinto, and one corporate seal. There were no certificates, so the seal was heated red hot and impressed on the stock itself. Sometimes it was impressed over the brands of the legal owners, but most of the time it only came in contact with mavericks. Cattlemen were opposed to the movement, but it flourished nevertheless, and the property of the trust went on increasing to an extent almost startling. Rustler Joe, as the president, vice president, secretary, and range foreman of the cattle trust, was now known. Was of such an impulsive, sensitive nature that people hesitated to take the initiative and converse with him on the subject. One man did mention the matter, and the way that Rustler Joe handled his nickel-plated, self-cocking articles of incorporation caused such a coolness to spring up that the man never spoke of the trust again. In fact, he never spoke at all. Then Joe took to himself a partner. Where that partner came from, nobody knew, but there he was, tall, handsome, long, dark, curling hair and mustache. He was certainly an ideal of a physical manhood to the range riders of the neighborhood, and then his spurs were of solid silver and had little silver bells hanging from them. His sombrero was of the finest Stetson make, and the crown was encircled by a bullion band. His revolvers were silver-plated and pearl-handled, and his saddle was silver-mounted, with gold embossed on the top of the horn. People looked wise and said that masses were being said for the soul of the Mexican that had owned that saddle, but they were careful not to talk too loudly. The partner was known as Charley, while Joe was the possessor of an unlimited amount of sand. It did not take people long to ascertain that Charley possessed a very limited quantity of that very desirable commodity, and when a diminutive Mexican first insulted and then, while under the influence of mezcal, assaulted Charley unpunished, he lost prestige entirely. The Mexican disappeared not long thereafter, but it was only a case of a missing greaser. It did not attract much attention. It was now nearing the third spring since Rustler Joe had settled in that section, and his neighbors nodded to each other, grinned, and remarked that the riders of the Spade Bar Sleeping Ass Band were apt to get contentious when Joe and Charley started in, and that there was going to be some fun. The outfit referred to was just in from Texas, and the boys in it had a reputation for being able to smoke a man at the drop of a hat. But the circumstance did not appear to faze the partners at all, for they kept on at their work of increasing the size of their corrals and making all preparations for a busy season. The evening after the roundup had begun, and while the young and old cattle were all bunched, Joe and Charley started out. All nature had taken on its brightest hues. The new grass was of the most delicate green. The cactus clumps were ablaze with blossoms of yellow, orange, pink, and white, and the sky was faintly tinted with the roseate colors of the coming sunset, and the snowy range glinted and glistened as though crusted with diamonds, and the near hogback foothills began in blue and gradually faded into the soft gray in the distance. A few insects listlessly chirped and hummed, while here and there came the shrill bark of a prairie dog or the dismal hoot of a companion of his burrow, the owl, and the two men paid no attention to the beauties before them. They were on a mission. They were out to pinch some promising mavericks, or some equally promising calves. They did not care which. While the maverick was considered common property by every cattle thief in the country, the calf still belonged to the brand that owned the mother cow. A few rods off grazed a cow with a calf at her side. The cow bore the brand of the Texas outfit. The calf had not been branded at yet, and the partners dropped a lariat over the neck of the little animal, which gave one frightened snort, a faint bellow, and then fell, half choked by the rope around its neck. "Tie her up," said Joe and Charley. "Take a few pieces of rope from the saddle pockets and tied the forefeet and the calf together." "Guess I'll take a hand in this year jackpot," called a cheery voice, and the next instant a knife had cut the ropes and the frightened calf scurried off after its mother. One of the Texas cowboys had come up unseen and had, with unequaled effrontery, intruded his presence on the cattle trust. Charley visibly paled. Joe changed not a muscle, but there was a hardening of the lines of his face, and his lower jaw protruded slightly. "Reckon you know that there maverick belongs to us," he said. "We roped it and claim it. That calf goes with its mother," said the Texan, "and I'm here look after the interest of my company." "You heard what I said," replied Joe menacingly, as he made a motion to pass the young man. A slight move of the hand toward the snakeskin belt where glistened with a 41, and then a crack from Charley's pearl-handled six-shooter. The cowboy sprang into air, came down on the high heels of his riding boots, pitched upon him his shoulders, and the spade bar sleeping-ass outfit was one man short. Before the report had died away, before the smoke ring from the greased barrel had broken, the little clump of cottonwoods at the left resounded with shouts and cowboys and yells. Horses plunged and whinnied, and in an instant more than a dozen range riders came tearing over the prairie toward the two men, their sombreros flapping, their rawhides, riatas, and saddle laces rattling, and flourishing their irons in a way that caused a hard light to come into the eyes of Rustler Joe. "Pull your freight," shouted Charley, and in a minute he was galloping across the sun-baked prairie straight for the foothills with Joe close behind him, little puffs of dust jumping up and near them as bullets from the pursuers dropped around and between the legs of the horses. But the trust were well mounted, and the little broncos of the cowboys were no match for the long-limbed, clean-cut States horses, and the distance between the two parties rapidly increased. The foothills were quite close when Charley's horse stuck his foot in a badger hole, throwing his rider, the horse turning completely over and landing on the horn of the saddle, which was driven full length into the hard earth. The fine bay rolled over, made a few attempts to regain his feet, and then sank back with a groan. His leg was broken. Joe, by this time, had ridden back and dismounted to assist his partner. The faint cheer came to his ears across the prairie. His pursuers, who were now lashing their ponies with their quirts, having seen the horse go down. Joe ground his teeth and loosed his belt from which hung his weapons, cast a look at the groaning bay, glared at the crowd of rapidly approaching cowboys from which he neither expected nor desired mercy, and then down at the sitting form of Charley, from whose forehead trickled a tiny stream of blood. "We're hard put to it," he muttered. "Guess this here boy is more life than I have, and two can't ride one horse. I'll take my turn at it." The pursuers were quite near now, and again their pistols began to crack and tear up the earth a few yards from him. He seized Charley around the waist, lifted him high with a muscular arm, and dropped him into his own saddle on the back of his beloved gray War Eagle. Charley faintly expostulated, and for the first time Joe had a slight feeling of disgust as he looked at the drawn face, those wild eyes and quivering limbs, all bespeaking an emotion to him almost unknown, fear. The feeling was gone in an instant, and as Charley had gathered up in the reins, Joe brought his hands down with a resounding smack on the horse's quarter, and the noble animal responded by a few bounds and then broke into a furious gallop, heading directly for the little cannon in the hills. Charley, cursing his cowardice in a frenzy of despair at the fate awaiting his friend, who had not a word to say even at the last against him, whose coward shot had brought this trouble on him, lacked the courage, the will to turn his horse's head and go back and fight with that friend. And so he urged War Eagle on through the few short moments that seemed an eternity, and then turned in the saddle and looked behind. He saw Joe stagger and fall limply to the earth. Two of the range riders pitched from the saddles, and two broncos rushed riderless from the mass of men and horses, and then came the reports of pistols faintly to his ears. He cried aloud. He again cursed himself the day he was born, shook his clenched fist at the blue and gold arc overhead, and then struck his spurs into the horse's flanks, and the beautiful animal again sprang forward. He was very near the mouth of the canyon. If he had not gained that, he might escape to the mountains, and someday he would come back, when this affair had quieted down, when he had found his courage. He looked back again. God above, how those Texans held on. They had taken up the chase again. The gray was breathing heavily, and Charley knew that, while the plains nothing could approach him, one in the mountains the weight of his horse would be against him, and that he would be no match for those tough little broncos. In between the walls of sandstone thundered the gray, and Charley felt a chill at the short interval of time between the passage and the echoes of his pursuers as they also entered. The canyon was dark and gloomy. The dusk was rapidly coming on, and the form of the mountains beyond came the faint rumblings of a storm. It was now 2 miles since the walls of the canyon had been entered, and every foot of the way up the bed of the dry creek, the walls on either hand seemed to grow more precipitous. The sound of the mountain storm increased, and with it came a faint swishing that caused War Eagle to throw his head in the air and snort. The sound increased. Charley looked back, and through the shadows of the canyon, he could see the Texas boys scrambling up the sides where it was less steep than here, while their ponies, standing in a circle with heads down and bunched, huddled closer and closer. What had caused those cowboys to leave their saddles? Charley was in the bottom of the basin. He would ride to the upper rim to see what had alarmed his pursuers. There was a ripping, roaring, grinding, and that moment became louder while the lightning flashes came nearer and nearer. Trees were rent, and there was splintering added to the din. Huge boulders were torn from their bases and came tearing and rumbling down. Charley gained the upper rim of the basin. His blood froze in his veins. The gray gave a bound and unseated the rider and threw him to the earth. Charley partially arose again and looked up the canyon. Oh heaven, it was a cloudburst, a black wall of water, foam crested, was even now speeding toward him. He must fly. The walls of the canyon were so steep that it seemed impossible to gain a foothold. He sprang at them. He tore with his nails and at the hard rock until his hands were lacerated and his fingertips shredded to the bone. At last he gained. He was going up. He caught up the twisted bough of a gnarled mountain pine. He gave it up its weight. The treacherous bow groaned, then snapped. Charley staggered, crouched wildly at a limb just out of reach, and pitched headlong over the 20-foot wall he had gained, striking on his left shoulder. He lay stunned for a brief moment, then sprang to his feet, his left arm hanging limp and motionless. He glanced wildly at his horse, whom he had to instinctively see stumbling over the loose rocks of the dry water course toward the bunch of the broncos. He looked back at the ridge of the hogback where he felt, rather than saw, his pursuers. Then he thought of Joe. He turned toward the wall of water, his head erect and his features composed, and slowly laid his hand upon his breast. Charley had found his courage. This has been How Charley Found His Courage, written by W.H. Cressingham, published in Short Stories, a magazine of fact and fiction, Volume 13, 1893. Narrated by Conan Stewart for Tales Reawakened on YouTube.